Hello everyone, today we talk about late 13th century English infantry, which is a topic that actually contains many different shades. Some of them are very important because they entail much of the military developments of not just of England, of the English military system, but also of the European one. As a consequence, during the 14th century, we all know what we're talking about, with the evolution of English armies into the 14th century towards a very specific tactics revolving around the combination of men-at-arms and longbowmen, so-called longbowmen, actually bowmen just with long bows, because that's really what it is, that begins in the late 13th century. As all the great military transformations, well, they never happen from one day to another. Most of the times they evolve. I mean, this is something I often say, that the great military reformers, right, they're not really inventing much. They're not really socially engineeringly, let's say, changing the whole substratum politically, socially, to have the type of military. Simply they accelerate or perfection and refine a military system that has already come into place, that just needs in fact to be ordered and to be given that full address. This is what will happen chiefly under the military genius of Edward III, that is the greatest and most complete genius in English history, that also had its own ones, and that is particularly important to understand. In fact, in this root phase. By the way, today we will talk about infantry, but I was searching for the pictures when I explain you how sometimes you come across certain things and you say, I was searching for, in fact, 13th century English infantry, right? So not even late 13th like we're gonna focus on chiefly now. And I'll give you that there is not an excessive amount of information about it, historically speaking, but I was realizing that even if you simply Google that or search for a picture or an image or kind of a more information, there is astonishingly few. I mean, I think I searched something for medieval English infantry, and the first thing Google suggested me is not even longbowman, but longbow. That is, you want to search for medieval English infantry of kind of all epochs, and all you have, it's not even the longbowman, but longbow proper. So that gives you the dimension, since it happens, those results are given through certain algorithms, etc., how polarized the attention has been around the weapon, even not even those who use that, but the weapon in itself. And today we will not strictly be talking about that, because that's a very complex topic. I still have partly and personally to deepen it better, to understand much of it, because it's not simple at all for how much discussed it's been historiographically speaking. And however, I would like to concentrate on this previous part, and I find that there's no evidence nor interest in the first place towards such a banal thing like infantry. That was, at least numerically speaking, the largest element into these armies, and that is not portrayed at all. There is not many people, at least in disproportionately, right, that take care about this. And so I would like to intertwine in this video a bit of the two elements, like talking a bit about infantry in general, and also this let's say the premises that brought for the development of archery in the way it transformed with the 14th century English tactics from this later phase. And this later phase has been naturally observed as, let's see what happened before to try to explain what happened afterwards. So let's give a look at it, and how infantry during the 13th century in general, aside from foot archers that actually in the 14th century also largely mounted. This is something that is usually overlooked and nevertheless is particularly important, because these weren't just plain foot archers, right? They were guys who were quite useful and very intensely engaged also into other operations on horseback, etc. So that I even have some interpretation on why certain tactics came into use even from a contingental from a contingental point of view, not really because a true doctrine about the employment of foot soldiers, men-at-arms, and longbowmen had been ideally conceived into the equation. There were certain strategical reasons for which those troops were eventually to fight on the field like that. But we will discuss them. If you're interested, by the way, I made a video that is a response to Schola Gladiatoria back in the day that was, why did English armies fight on foot? That is, during the Middle Ages, which is kind of an approximation, of course, and in fact it's been overly exaggerated. This thing, in fact, what I was criticizing of that video in the first place was this idea that there was somehow a predisposition of the Kingdom of England's military, or at least of English society, to produce fighters on foot. I've heard some of the most diverse things, like that, that's because they resembled more kind of a northern phase for which of war that was kind of more similar to Scandinavian armies that were kind of more on foot and all this. This is kind of gibberish, actually. At this point, England is a fully feudal kingdom. It has a very typical phase, if you want, and that doesn't have a big deal of infantry in the first place in terms of power of infantry, etc. But it's exactly looking at the feudal hierarchy of England and the general control of the monarchy on the military resources that should make you realize why something like that happened. Today we'll try to give an answer even to that. So, and this point is important because if you look back and say, what was English infantry about, like in the 13th century, before the great what was the English army in the 14th, you see that there is not really much that characterizes that world compared to other regions of Europe, that there is actually no military custom or tradition that would apparently justify such a transformation. So if you look, for example, at the time of Henry III, when he issued his new Assize of Arms in 1242, so we're kind of an early date in the century, you see that the bow has a solid extension among most of the recruitment categories of the English infantrymen, right? And this is something not so strange after all, because if you look at the recruitment systems of medieval Europe, basically all over the continent, especially the lowest ranks of society was, when called to arms, was required was issued to provide at least bow and arrow. I mean, that's really a standard thing since the migration era, and that's present literally everywhere. There is not even a single country where it's not like that. And the idea is that not a great deal of importance is attributed to archery in that case, because this recruitment systems reflect a social segmentation where actually the bulk of the military force, that is, I give you usually minority number, most of the times at least for the single categories, is represented by fighters like obviously armored horsemen, that at this time in the 13th century are at the apex of their tactical predominance on the battlefields everywhere in Europe, England included. Then obviously kind of a lighter cavalry, then infantry with some kind of spear, sword, etc. And then the archers are really like the beggars of the situation, something like that. Obviously, this is a simplistic approach, obviously, also to it, but the general concept, the general balance stays on that, right? So medieval Europe in this 13th century now is a largely feudalized and generally now a fully sedentarized continent, right? So it doesn't have a any particular fascination for anything like archery or horse archery. Is something that existed. It kind of always existed, but it was kind of relegated into some other specific activity. On Schwerpunkt, I recall very often how actually archery was probably much more widespread than what medieval sources tell us about, because of many reasons. Some of them are cultural and political at the same time. That is that Europe at this time is very, very soaked imbued in this feudal and let's say warrior and warlike idea that fundamentally if you shoot someone on the distance, you're a coward, right? So that weapons like slings, the slings, for instance, in the ancient world had been all over the place. Now you rarely find men. I mean, they're scattered all over medieval Europe, but in proportion to other weapons, you don't find them mentioned very much. You find them in the case of the British environment. If you look at the Celtic fringe, yeah, but because that was not a feudalized area. It wasn't more than much, and it kind of had its own more, if you want, more primitive traditions. But 13th century is kind of the rise chiefly of crossbow. And what you see, even at the end of the 13th century and in the beginning of the 14th, is that crossbowmen are, in the English army, are paid actually more than longbowmen. Or bowmen, because, by the way, the term longbow is something that appears chiefly towards the late Middle Ages. It wasn't even called like that, because there is nothing like the longbow as a weapon. European bows are built in one way, historically speaking, and one way only. That's what you get, and that's pretty much it. There are kind of minor refinements you can do, but the methods of constructions, the performance, they're kind of the same. The longbow is literally a long adjective, bow, substantive, and that's what it means. And what it takes to use a longer bow than the usual is obviously more capabilities, very often sheer force, because the technique to shoot effectively with a bow naturally is kind of complicated. It's always there, but now the longer the bow is, the more exercise you have to do, and that's particularly important because it also tells you that, little spoiler, that what was happening in England wasn't at all in the 14th century anything spontaneous like it had been happening like in Flanders or in Scotland. It was something directed from the above, from the monarchy chiefly, right? That channeled those resources into those tactics that turned out to be so effective. So I don't remember the point I was making. That is, the crossbow also was explained. By the way, England was this might be maybe some sort of indicator that England had seemingly. So the spread of crossbows pretty late. I mean, usually Richard Lionheart, Richard I, is credited from having gotten them back from the Crusades, because when he was taking the battle over Sofara, he was using Italian crossbowmen for fencing off the Saracen attacks and horse archers, etc. And he was so thrilled by these crossbows that he allegedly imported them in England. I personally believe that this is an approximation that even tells you something real, because naturally by the time of Richard I, the crossbow was really spreading fast. There were certain regions of Europe that were kind of more ahead into this. In fact, Italy chiefly, but also in France, this kind of spread fast. And as you know, the English kings at this time were quite involved into French affairs. Richard I, between the Crusades and his wars in France, was pretty much spent most of his time outside of his kingdom, so the idea is that England, being more peripheral, relatively at least to the rest of Europe, kind of got to this later. So it's possible, it may be just a tiny factor that crossbow spread relatively later, but I don't think there is in there, so that maybe bow archery was something more widespread on average. But I don't believe that that's really, especially when you talk about technology, it's never like that. I mean, if something was unknown and it had the necessary ground, the fertile ground to be developed, it usually happened pretty quickly, right? I would look at other factors and maybe brought the archery into play more into England. First of all, England was very rural at this time. I mean, the crossbows spread chiefly into areas that were kind of already pretty solidly urbanized, had on their technical and engineering autonomous developments with craftsmen and all. England was relatively, London obviously was a great European center, but the whole rest of the country was in some way very, very rural, even the lifestyle. The crossbows were obviously used even to hunt, etc. But I'd like to look at the English countryside, saying that it was on average kind of more rural, even if you want more, let's say, wilder in some ways, for which the local peasantry kind of maintained more or less without many external influences the military tradition, so that maybe the bow was more widespread in terms of the average levy that could be raised here and there. By the way, we know that England had very often the best bowers, the best archers communities were associated to certain woods in England that were praised for this, and were meant to provide that kind of, and they had even extra demands. If you look at these asses of arms, you realize that the bowman had to this woodsman had to provide more archery than the average levy, and because they were prized, because they were making a living out of using partly that thing, and this opens also to another great chapter, that is to say that, and this is not an opinion of any sort. This is how really history, how we know it, that Welsh archery had absolutely nothing to do, and I repeat it, nothing to do with the development of the longbow in the English army. Absolutely nothing. This is a myth, and there is no historical evidence whatsoever to support it. It was born just because Giraldus Cambrensis had to write that the Welsh were particularly skilled with the bow, with longbow, and there is essentially that's pretty much it. And from all the other evidence that you have, including the fact that there were longbowmen in England way before they had the end of the 13th century and their Welsh campaigns, etc. The longbow exists since prehistory. It's been found in Somerset something like, 20,000 years ago or something like that. I don't remember now. The longbow is not in any way a national weapon. It is not even an English national weapon. Longbows were present everywhere. Think about the Needham bows. Think about the Viking Age. They were all over there. They were known since the times of the Romans. Because the longbow is just a long bow and nothing else. So that the bigger guy, because this is how it worked really, just like for armor and other weaponry, simply used larger stuff. So weapons and armors were calibrated and produced on the base of the size of the guy. So the myth of the Welsh that somehow teach the Englishmen to use longbows is absolute myth. It has no grounding whatsoever into reality. English archers were paid better than and solidly better than Welsh archers in this phase. That is chiefly at the end of the 13th century, talking about Edward I's reign, right? They were present even obviously before the Welsh campaigns, and we will see this in a while. And also it was full of other nationalities. I mean, there were even Scots or Gascons eventually that were hired as bowmen into even later 14th century armies. And no doubt there were lots of Welsh mercenaries into that were recruited as bowmen, but there is no influence whatsoever that these were best trained or that had somehow a more tradition of that particular bow that was superior or inferior to England for that matter whatsoever, right? And there is no other evidence to that. Yes, when the Anglo-Normans invade Ireland at one point, it says that there was the Welsh youth that kind of knocked down lots of Irish with their bows and all this stuff, but that's kind of the very few things that there is. And for all the material, especially we have, all the evidence we have for this later phase when the longbow starts developing, there is absolutely no connection between an alleged Welsh influence on the English army for this somehow to have happened, right? This is quite important to understand because it's a stupid technologistic prejudice that means to not know anything on how the longbow tactics, if you want to call it in this way, actually developed. And it's way more complex, at least, than that, and especially it has nothing to do with that. So this is important to focus, and this is not my opinion. This is quite well known. I mean, just read Bradbury or any other updated serious historiographical work that exists on the matter. The idea is that, however, it doesn't seem that if you look at the sources of 13th century England, even of previous centuries, you find that there were bows. There were crossbows, and that the fact that crossbows were allegedly brought by Richard I is very debatable. I personally believe that actually crossbows never ceased to be into use from the ancient world, which had them both in classical times, in late Roman times, and whatever that they were introduced, like in the 12th or in mass, at least in the 13th century, because I believe that surely there was some Norman guy that in 1066 invaded Anglo-Saxon England with a crossbow of some sort. Of course, they weren't the very strong and powerful and enhanced crossbows of the 13th century, but the concept is always there. The technology is very simple, and you don't really need to have evidence to understand that such a tool could be quite simply used, right? And so you find bows everywhere. Like, think about even Hastings, how the Normans showered the Anglo-Saxon shield wall to try to soften up. By the way, they don't succeed. So the bow was there evidently, but we don't have any evidence from the sources of the 12th, the 13th century to say, well, in England the use of bow was more or less pronounced than other places, right? Because simply sources tend not to tell you about that. But in my opinion, it was really not even particularly a more used bow than another. I can't think of the more rural landscape of England, the more kind of traditional way of war in there, maybe a later update to crossbow technology, but crossbows are there throughout all the 13th century. There is no way to tell. They were even paid more than archers. So any sort of predisposition of the English infantry in this case, because by the way, horse archers I don't think are mentioned by sources. Also in here, it doesn't mean that they weren't there. Every single nobleman all over Europe knew how to use a bow on horseback, because hunting was one of the primary activities out there in the aristocracy, and it was carried out like that. So it's just that obviously there were more effective tactics on the field. This time they're basically being all about ultra heavily armored horsemen that to create this shock cavalry charges against the enemy's formations. of cavalrymen chiefly, because at this time infantry is, especially in this context, most feudalized countries like northern France or England, they seem not to have had any particular strength. The kind of at this time it was Flanders and Italy that had kind of the most evident infantrymen that achieved even something in terms of facing enemy, let's say facing heavy cavalry, and so yeah, the bow was used, crossbows and bows. That's all we know. And I don't think we will ever know much more than that. I mean, I admit I'm not an expert myself on 13th century England at all, and I would like actually to deepen my knowledge, but as far as I know, there is no evidence of that, and probably not even a huge attention to the topic in itself, because, or at least it's disproportionate. The attention is disproportionately shifted towards the 14th and 15th century, when you already have the longbow tactics fully developed and having the most obvious outcome. So this fact that by the Assize of Arms of 1242 we see maybe a higher proportion of bows is also debatable, because there is even the same Henry III raised, for example, in 1266 500 archers in the Weald, and that's pretty much it. And there are astonishingly very few other references to archery, even in a period of major of warfare during the Civil War of 1264-1267. By the way, I've read, if you read Bradbury, I mean, you realize that most of the reference to these things are, the English kings were also involved into fighting elsewhere. So maybe there were other influences. This is for sure. But to the English system specifically, there is no evidence that before the late 13th century, the bow had gained somewhat a higher significance. And by the way, it's normal. This doesn't mean that it didn't happen. I have my idea of the story, because the English kingdom had its own troubles. We know that English society was kind of progressively falling out of control, obviously after the Magna Carta, the defeat of 1214 and Magna Carta in 1215, and all the reinforcements of baronial rule and this civil wars that also ensued. There is a kind of an increasing lack of control, kind of a more messy management of the kingdom. Otherwise, the Normans had very solidly founded. And by the way, it's in many ways the Norman legacy, even during the Angevin time, that maintains things straight. And nevertheless, for this very exact reason, the English kingdom has a very unitary control, however, compared to many other countries. Of course, England is relatively small, also doesn't have an enormous population. So in part it was well contained. Obviously it was the main power on the island. There wasn't an enormous risk. The major risks actually came from across the channel. So there is an idea of mine that is that, however, throughout the 13th century, as it happens, by the way, in other lands in Europe, in most of European countries at that time, there might have been and usually in this moment of strife and confusion, and relative strife, at least in confusion, is that progressively the things get worse, socially speaking. So there might have been actually one factor, that is, remember the lower ranks of the recruitment classes in the Assize of Arms. It says any other recruitment system about the bow. Well, it may have been possible now, especially with the strengthening of feudalism, because it doesn't seem that 13th century England was 13th century England was kind of rising in some ways, but it was, I think, a well-grounded feudal system, so that the local peasantry, also the burghers, didn't quite have this tumultuous rise that you find in places like, in fact, Flanders or Italy, or places where infantries, in fact, were stronger than the average. So my idea is that it's possible that during the 13th century, as in other places in Europe, the much of the relative, social equilibrium that had existed before brought many more people to be impoverished and to fall into the lower ranks, the ones that were issued during by the call to arms to serve with bow and an arrow. And this is maybe not just a need that obviously is presented from the bottom of society, so that especially at this time, it's not that you can make too much social engineering to cope with this, but I think it was something partially researched even by the same crown for one very evident reason, that is that bowmen, in this sense, having the cheapest equipment, they're much cheaper to raise, to and even to maintain, because actually even if you have to a horseman it's kind of a too obvious example, but even if you have a better equipped infantryman, say even with a coat of mail or something like that, well, you have even to it's more energy, it's more calories you have to invest and to pay for in order to shift that thing, and all it was his own equipment along with the army. So it might have been a sum of factors that the English kings at this point, especially from Edward I, so fit and more convenient to raise these larger bodies of troops that were kind of cheaper, but they still have this tactical effectiveness that, as we will see now, was particularly well suited to certain strategic theaters into which the English went to fight in. That are Wales and Scotland. So there is now here I read even that there is evidence of bows, very scant evidence of bows actually survived in here, that do not suggest that at this time even the longbow was absolutely the prevalent type. The average type was the short bow, so called unitly because there is a longbow, but it was kind of the average bow at the time, right, for the average sized man, right? And the longbow starts appearing kind of later, right? In this later phase under Edward I, Longshank, and he engages, in this successful campaigns into Wales and to Scotland, basically bringing Wales to submission largely now to subdue one country now. At this time is a kind of a complicated stuff. With Scotland, he succeeds formally, but as you know, there were several developments at this point that it's very interesting, by the way, that eventually the Scots kind of gained their own independence in a moment in which and with military tactics that were in this sense truly obviously not revolutionary, because there is nothing like a revolution in warfare at that time. It's something new. They were innovative, although not as, I wouldn't say rather innovative, rather exceptional like the English ones that were actually to earn I think rightfully a higher place into the memoirs of military history, and I will explain you why later, because, or actually maybe now, because objectively, if you were to look at all armies in history and to confrontate in terms, in conditions of relative symmetry, that is to say, okay, that I hate to put it in these terms because war is always asymmetric by definition, but let's say, between France and England during the 14th century, it's not that there weren't many differences. There were no technological differences, there were basically no other, in terms of material, culture, even of social, the world system was practically the same. So in these conditions of approximated symmetry, what you have is the English armies, the time of Edward III, were objectively the strongest armies in history, which is not my opinion, but it's simply a mathematical observation, because there is no other army in history that achieved, in conditions of that specific numerical inferiority, the degree of success that they did. And there is no point in this. You can't look at a Rome or at other, and this doesn't mean that there is no superior or inferior. That was just the outcome, and it happened because it was contingential to that context, and that's it. So live with it, and don't try weird escapes, because nobody here cares on this channel to favor one nationality or the other. I personally don't give a fuck about that. It's completely out of any of my possible interest. I'm just telling you things for what I try to understand them. In these two set of campaigns, in the Celtic fringe, see the rise, seemingly. Also here the development is very foggy as well, and it's mostly from posterior evidence that already that obviously shows us that certain things that were in place at the beginning of the 14th century had to, given the level of development, had to have been up there before, right? The increase of the longbow, right? Many people say, why does this happen? So the reason why technologistic answers are stupid is that because they concentrate exclusively on the longbow, right? And that's why so many people just Google longbow if you want to understand something about it. I won't hide you, though, that in the longbow, in this case, I am against technologistic prejudices, but this is one of the very few cases in history in which there was a technology that, in itself, and this weapon, that kind of conferred an edge of some sort. Obviously, the longbow and the longbowmen do not win battles alone. They are the forgotten heroes of the story. Let's say that they're the poor men at arms that stay in the front line to absorb the heaviest blows of the enemy cavalry, etc. There is no army of bowmen in history that wins out there. You always need the shock element, both to defend and counterattack. The longbowman has a sort of progressive adaptation even to sort of hand-to-hand combat, but it's not primarily conceived to do that. Like I think the elite of longbowmen, thinking about the longbowman of the guard, etc., is at best medium infantry. If you were to look at the whole range of heaviness that was out there, so it's obviously something that is not conceived by itself to engage into fight, but just to stay out in the lower ranks and to shoot, right? Sometimes even in the front, because obviously the longbowman is not but well protected by stakes in ditches, and so that is also very important, because also the great series of victories of infantry over heavy cavalry in the first half of the 14th century. Obviously the English ones go on, but that they're always, and they continue to be, aided even by certain types of grounds and field fortifications, because cavalry is still the heck powerful, and you can't really ignore that. And actually part of the reason why I have my doubts even about the actual formulation of a real kind of doctrine that is even a kind of an anachronistical term, given we're talking about Middle Ages, is that if you look at the tactical situations in which the major longbow victories that were not just longbow victories, but also men-at-arms victories combined, because this is combined tactics, happened in a moment when the enemy was overwhelmingly superior in numbers. So that it also was loaded with a very a greater aggressive capability, right? So the idea of dismounting both men-at-arms and archers obviously derives from the fact that you have to defend. Cavalry by definition cannot defend as an arm. This is one of the essential principles of warfare. You have to dismount, hence that becomes infantry. And that's what happened in battles like Crécy or Azincourt, etc. And therefore at that point you basically use the best of your options, right? Because it's not that there is this prejudice that I found very widespread. I don't know how true it is, but I personally think it's irrelevant, or at least virtually insignificant in the praxis of warfare, that the English had this higher foot combat tradition. I don't think absolutely this is true. Absolutely not. I mean, there were probably certain contingencies like the one we have listed before. Even if you look at the wars, the War of the Roses, there are certain, in that case, especially political reasons for which you would fight on foot rather than on horse, because that was to knock out the enemy. A nobleman that also had this very strong kind of ethos of 1 versus 1, all that stuff, because it took just to knock out that guy and to blow out his entire, the entire genealogical problem who had to inherit what, and that was the objective, that was the Schwerpunkt of the situation. But for the rest, the English armies were basically equipped even in the same kind of way. I mean, there is no preferably if the men-at-arms would still fight on horseback, because that was his and was obviously trained to do the reverse even in the other countries. French knights dismounted all the time. It was normal for a knight, especially for a man-at-arms, to fight literally in every single kind of situation, literally, because that was what medieval professionalism of the feudal elite was all about. Knights were trained to fight with every single weapon that existed, including bows, and that there were tactical contingencies for it was better to do otherwise. Obviously, it as we said before, is pretty evident. So what happened really? If it's not really about the bow, why the bow, and why would these campaigns against the Welsh and the Scots would bring to this during this end of the 13th century? Well, this is a chapter would deserve another video, and I promise I will do it one day. But to make the long story short, I have an hypothesis, at least, which is partly conjectural for the Welsh campaigns, and not so conjectural at all, because I'm not the only one who thinks of this for the Scottish wars. So the idea is that if you want to go at war into Wales, we know that the English had gone there since ever they came into Britain, since migration era. They knew what Wales was really about. Terrible terrain, forests, mountains. Cavalry also has lots of prowling there, and the Celtic fringe, generally speaking, fights with skirmishing tactics. So really the best thing you would do, and this is something that even Harold Godwinson did back in the day when he fought against the Welsh, it was to use more, so to tell you how logical and rational it would be to increase the use of archery, which is obvious. If you have an enemy that stays there, entrenched into behind barricades on a slope with all forests around, etc., what you want to do, you take it down with bows. And there is actual evidence at this time during, in fact, the Welsh Wars. There was a battle, I don't remember which was it, but it was on a longer bridge where basically the Welsh were from the other side of the river, and the English had to break through. And basically the tactics was something that happens also elsewhere in military history in the Middle Ages, many places, is you would create a sort of cover fire, suppression fire with the archers, and you would make knights charging against like stormtroopers onto the heavy on the enemy's defenses, which something you would you have to do, because the knight at this point is the only guys that there is, as I say, decently equipped, at least, or best equipped in relative terms, to go against enemy fire, right? Just remember this time that basically everything that is worn by the knight in the best of his equipment, of course, is bulletproof. Even with the introduction of the crossbows, etc., you see that there is in parallel the development of coat of plates that is incidentally happening exactly in this last decades of the 13th century. So until basically the 15th, the 16th century, you don't have any weapon that is too effective for making armor too expensive to be not just to be produced, but even to be used practically, even for its weight, etc., on the battlefield. So that's what the knight basically does. And what a best option than archers to create that necessary suppression fire to facilitate this assault. So in a hell of a ground where the enemy tends to engage you at distance as well, and this would explain even why Giraldus Cambrensis back in the 12th century would say, well, the Welsh kind of have this kind of very strong bows that penetrate even the coat of armor, of mail, piercing through the knight's thigh and even into the horse belly in one shot. But that was kind of one Welsh once that is, remembered by Giraldus, but that's suited for the context, and the English, as we've seen, had perfectly their own archers on their own, and they would try to, okay, let's go to war again into Wales, and let's bring archers, because that's a sensible choice you want to do. It's not that these guys were dumb; they perfectly knew how to fight with bows like any other people on earth since prehistory. So that's a valid option. So let's say that the environment of Wales would call for that specific necessity. Now, this obviously means even to train troops in there that are possibly well suited for that kind of warfare. So definitely hiring Welsh archers. That I don't want you to get me wrong. I said that the Welsh influence on the English armies is obviously does not entail at all that the English developed longbow tactics from the Welsh. It's absolutely true. This also absolutely doesn't mean that the Welsh were bad archers at all. They were simply average, right? Or at least they were good archers as much as they could be found elsewhere, like into those English woods that we were mentioning before. So the idea at the end of the day is the English now are kind of used to use bows, and they, for some reason that partly related even to a sort of obvious factor, is that when you start fighting, the 13th century is a moment of great professionalization of troopers, and what happens is that there are more wars. There are more people that make war for a living, right? The feudal system at this point is at its peak, but it's already kind of fluidifying. It's melting partly, and what this means is that basically you don't actually rely on feudal levies proper, at least in their full potential, but just, first of all, you kind of pay them already. I made a couple of videos about this. And secondly, you hire lots of mercenaries that have nothing to do with, at least not necessarily to do with the feudal system. Even though they were noblemen sometimes on their own, but they were doing them as kind of free contractors, right? That's what the time of mercenary companies starts, basically. It starts in the 13th century, but, to be a systemic thing, but it also kind of existed before. So what happens is that probably there was some bowmen there who had been fighting an English army that would maybe coming back home, didn't have anything, was too poor, decided to re-enlist again into these wars that were being fought that attracted people to even to loot and all this stuff. And also another anti-technologistic idea is that all the time in history you find the even during the modern age where firearms were out there, you realize that what was important or required by those who hired troops was not even the equipment. It was rather the skill, the experience of the personnel. This is particularly important. I was reading that about 18th century navies, is that it's not they were asking for more cannons, they were asking for better trained sailors. And that's the same thing in all military history. So what happens is that probably for a sum of reasons now that socially speaking maybe many people had impoverished and fallen into the lower ranks that were issued with bows and arrows for the army. Also because maybe the English crown now wanted, obviously financial problems were all over the place all the time. They wanted to hire cheaper troops. 3, maybe because they were veterans who wanted to, from the Welsh Wars, etc. The English go out war into Scotland apparently with already, not really terribly superior numbers of archers than the average, but with a consistent part of them, right? So something that could be of use out there. Now against the Scots, the war is a bit different. It's obviously, as most medieval warfare is still kind of raiding, pillaging. It's more a robbery than actual pitched battles. Pitched battles happen, and exactly at this time, the Scots are developing their famous, infantry tactics that would be, more, it would expand, more evidently, more, let's say, I missed the term, but with more consequences, evidently in the 14th century. But there is some interesting program even into the late 13th. We have to make more history of battles. I will have to do it. And so there are certain situations in open field where the English are confronted with the Scots who have this very solid pikemen's formations. There are many pikemen. They have a certain degree. They're actually fighting for their own, land in some way. So they are determined. They're, even they're kind of rough. They have seen pretty bad things. They know why they're there. So they're skill determined. There are many, and they have pikes, and they're solid enough. And this has started for many reasons that also have not to do chiefly with Scotland. It's happening elsewhere in Europe, in Flanders, in Switzerland, in the German Dithmarschen. It's happening a bit in some places. So the problem now is that the standard European tactics, including the one of feudal England, that also had some of the finest cavalry at this point out there, was in fact mostly mounted combat, right? Having, as we've said before, this shock tactics with cavalry charges against the enemy ranks to make them waver and to flee. What happens now is that the Scottish formations are too hard to be broken in the usual way, right? And so the English look at their cards and say, okay, we have cavalry, we have some infantry, but look, here we have archers. So let's do something. Let's soften up the Scottish ranks with arrows, right? And they do, and it works, because it turns out that if you shower a formation for some time, the Normans knew it. We remembered Hastings before, so it's sensible. It's simply a sensible military, I would say, evidence. I go that far that you want to break a little bit those formations down by harassing them with missile fire, which doesn't mean that it wasn't done previously, but at this point seemingly had a greater importance. And it turns out that now this makes archery better, a better option. You need more archers, because if you're confronted with other similar situations, now you know how to cope with them. So now, without going into detail to this part that is kind of even beyond our scopes today, what happens is that by beginning of the 14th century, so with all the mess that eventually ensues with Scotland and all this stuff, that eventually will see the English defeat. However, the English find themselves with, for this sum of factors, with more archers than the average. And what you see is that this is starting to be enhanced even by, in the full 14th century, by monarchical incentives, like, there is all this idea that even the English youth has to practice during the local festivals for, using a bow to be trained, etc. So that basically the English monarchy was pushing the local society for having skilled bowmen. That is something extremely different from what was happening, say, in Scotland or in Flanders, because in there nobody had told these guys to train or to use a weapon. And by the way, most of them actually didn't, because it's not that a Scottish peasant or a Flemish burgher had this terrific military experience. Most of them went to battle without even having ever had to taken a weapon before in their hands. What happens in England, that where you don't find this local revolts of the middle classes that you find in these other areas of Europe, well, not in Scotland, but in case of Flanders it's kind of more exemplified. But let's say that in England there is no problem like this. Like the monarchy is able, after all, to control society, more or less. It's mostly the barons and their feudal retinues that create the greatest problems. So that's still heavy cavalry. They can have troops on foot on their retinues, actually the same as of arms. And other provisions told obviously that if you were a nobleman, you have to rise in part not just cavalry but foot soldiers as well, foot levies at least. And so what happens in England is that it's much more engineeringly worked from a social point of view. The monarchs just wants to have a ready pool of available archers that by themselves are really useless, because, as we were saying before, it's not that you can make armies of archers. You need men-at-arms still to make that effective. The archer is some of the easiest thing to butcher down in absolute terms. If there is no support, you can even have ditches and stakes and all this stuff, but if you don't have something consistent like heavy infantry or cavalry defending them, they're screwed. So that was a relatively non-subversive measure to create a let's say a class of subjects, let's put it in this way, that could be used for that type of war. Then it turns out that, for instance, the Welsh pour in enormous numbers into the English armies during the 14th century, partly, in my opinion, probably because they were poorer, because they had this higher need to make. I mean, the wars had devastated Wales, of course, that they would make a living into this risky thing, while the average English subject would simply say, okay, well, I don't need that, I can still work my land, and that's it. So that's even probably where a bit the myth of the Welsh skill in bow has been originated from. Lots of them were Welsh eventually, yeah, but that doesn't tell that they were necessarily better skilled than the English in that sense, and there is no sensible evidence for that. And therefore, in the 14th century, this is fully understood. I mean, this goes on. It goes on like a trend during the time of Edward I, Edward II, and it's Edward III that really puts it all together in its fullest form, right? It starts achieving this astonishing series of victories that sometimes it's not even because he was in charge, in command. They actually remain as a kind of model, right? And that is reflected by this composition of the army. So, in my opinion, it's relatively difficult to to say whether this was really something so moved from the above, like was it really a choice to have those kind of troops, or it was sometimes how they could be hired? Because sometimes really the way you recruit armies is not really because you can't choose much of that. You simply have that material available, like those human resources available, and that's what you can get. And with the given proportions, certain number of longbowmen are good as much as other infantry, let's say melee infantry or cavalry, right? In fact, what you see in 14th century English armies, which was astonishing, is the number of longbowmen. I mean, these were by far elite troops or sharpshooters. And that has nothing to do with the true nature of longbow tactics. The true nature of longbow tactics is that you make all thousands of archers shooting at the same time, creating a volume of fire that you can, at that time you basically can't achieve with much else, because crossbows are slower, and they're even kind of relatively well, let's leave aside expanse for a moment, but that's something that it's pretty impressive, right? So I was looking today at one Osprey picture, one of the books dedicated to longbow, and I saw this situation of longbows, a bunch of longbowmen in the forefront, even I think of in front of stakes, with other heavy infantry behind. They were kind of killing, literally, horsemen at close range, as if it was it was shooting like a machine gun, like a few meters away. Now, beautiful painting. I don't know what it was. I don't remember the author, but that's absolutely not how it worked. By the way, there's not a single evidence that I know, and that other historians that I've talked with know, of a single longbow shot that killed an armored man. I mean, yeah, if you raise the visor and there is a face, an arrow that strikes you in the face, like would happen to the unfortunate Henry V, that would still keep into use long bows, as we know, to very great profit. Well, that's one thing, but as we were saying before, armor always updates itself effectively. The point in here was obviously hitting chiefly the horses, but creating confusion and disorder in the enemy charge. It's not that they effectively stopped the enemy charge. French knights arrived into the stakes and fighting hand to hand. It's not they were killed before. But if you destroy a charge hoarder, that's really what you achieve, what you render. And obviously there are other factors that all combined produce those victories in particular. But these mechanisms are sometimes gotten wrong, at least popularly speaking. But getting back a little bit into actual say the rest of English infantry towards the late 13th century. So if you look at Henry III's Assise, you see that the recruitment system required that all freemen with something between 100 shillings of land and from 9 to 20 marks of chattels or cattles, I don't know whether should serve with bow, arrows. We don't know how many arrows. This is sometimes, probably they were issued to have something like between 20-30 arrows, something like that, to bring with them. But usually the Kingdom of England was a kingdom of ancient military organization. At this time, even if you look at Longshanks' armies, their artillery was dramatically, artillery meaning siege equipment at this time, was dramatically well organized. They even had part of the organization dealt with creating round-shaped projectiles for the trebuchet, bringing them alongside. So there was this attention toward organization that reflects the much tighter grip that the English monarchy had compared to others since the time of the Norman conquest, right? Because they had really, raised lots of things to the ground. They had managed how to control the local population effectively, and these troops were also to be equipped with a sword. This is interesting because a sword, I mean, if you take the 14th century, the sword is something relatively cheap that at that point even the average longbowman can afford, right? We're not talking about knives or daggers that were also some of these records were issued to have, especially the one with land. So not the one with chattels or cattles. I think cattle is the right word, but the right pronunciation. But the sword in 1242, well, that's not something rare, that rare, but still expensive, especially for guys that are supposed to go to war just with bow and arrow. Which, by the way, means that even before those campaigns of the late 13th century, there was this idea that at least the archer may have had to really get into melee, right? Then here we are not told actually how the various military supplies were organized within the army, because when you read these recruitment systems, you don't have to think that what these records were issued to bring with them was really all what the army was about. Obviously, there was a much broader organization that added lots of other stuff. Let's leave aside food, that is always something primary in this, but even for weapons, like arrows were presumably also bought by the crown, and this is how it would get into the 14th century. 14th century, there were lots of discounts ordered by the crown on arrow makers, simply because they needed freaking lots of arrows to carry out those longbow tactics we were talking to you before. So, however, this is particularly interesting, right? And the freeman with between 40 and 100 shillings of land had to have a dagger as well, right? So, if you look at Edward I's Statute of Winchester of 1285, realize that there is, however, a mere confirmation of these particular regulations of 1242. So they were still applied. There doesn't seem to be a radical change at all, actually. So probably, this is what made me curious when I was preparing for this video, because I would like to know way more about English infantry, say, towards the mid-13th century, because it might have as well happened, especially for such a big change, like it will start occurring from like the 13th century. Probably bowmen had already might have gained, even though we have any proof of this, apparently some importance that we still have, in fact, difficulties to focus on, right? Because we don't really know that much. The only substantial update in this recruitment system is in 1298, when the king issued the mounted knights to provide a bard for their horses to be barded substantially. And this is something I think pretty normal in the, generally speaking, it's in the European average. Like coat of mail for horses obviously existed in part somewhat before, but the late 13th century is the moment when this starts to appear more consistently. At least this was for the highest ranks of classes of recruitment, of course, because horse armor was painfully expensive. So this is, at this point, even the knight is getting heavier with coat of plates, etc. And there was surely some other form of horse armor before, but it was not like the full coat of mail. At least was something very exceptional, right? But this happens elsewhere in Europe, so it really doesn't tell us much. If not, that missile power was probably increasing, because you can make a parallelism between what is happening in England with the longbow and what was happening partially in England itself as well, but also in the rest of Europe with crossbow, right? As we were saying before, this higher degree of armored equipment is directly functional. It is usually explained actually with the increase in firepower, because the idea is it's not that the heavier you are and the better it is. The heavier you are and the better protected you are, but also the more fatigued you get. Right? So it must have been caused by not just because people were wealthier or because certain social classes were getting up, the elite was getting increasingly more elite. There is something else as well that is technological is going on. Now, interestingly enough, in the aforementioned XIII, freemen with less than 40 shillings or 9 marks of chattels were also expected to serve with a bow, right? If they had one. Otherwise, they had to make do with falses also. There were probably, I don't think these were falchions, but rather fauchards. The fauchard is a pole arm, which was the falchion is a sort of sword with a very thin blade and very broad towards the top. It mostly serves to chop in against unarmored opponents most of the time, because against armor it's useless. It actually crashes. The fauchard is a pole arm weapon, and it's made with it kind of lasted for long. And actually, these were all pole arms usually evolved from agricultural tools, right? And at this time that we're evolving, right? It has even the shape actually changes most of the time. The original fauchard is this blade with kind of a pointy end and some other spikes, let's say, around the back of the blade, and it kind of developed probably from the war side or military side, so from the Scheider Falks is called. And the principle is that you have this cutting edge turned opposite, convex instead of concave, so that the weapon is good both for thrusting and slashing, right? Nothing so effective as you can imagine, because actually these weapons weren't, I mean, they were obviously effective in terms of, especially killing unarmored opponents and stuff like that, but they were weapons for poor people, right? Because whoever uses pole arm usually is because he's too has to engage the enemy at distance because it's not armored enough, right? So, and this kind of weapons, contrarily wise to what is commonly believed, are absolutely not effective against cavalry charge, for stopping cavalry charges, until you don't have pikes and in a kind of a solid quantity, and with kind of people were quite determined to withstand cavalry charges for some good reason. You don't really have anything really effective. Even the halberd can crush. It's like a tin opener, but only when the knight is already on the ground and you can finish him off. But for that you can even have other like big axes, other blunt weapons, other stuff like that. But this was the equipment at least could be used to contain type of lighter cavalry. Why not other infantry? And you could engage at distance. That's the principle of the pole arm. But these people that, as we see from the XIII here, are poor. Those are guys who are poorer and have less than 40 shillings of land in 9 marks of chattels, right? So really not all this much. So they could make with they could exchange the bow for fauchard, for the Goose Arm, or Goose Arm as it's called. There's another pole arm, pole weapon, and it's the form here. I think I have. There is actually some debate about this, because the Goose Arm can sometimes assume different It's not enormously different from, it has a kind of a blade that is curved towards the top, towards the external, but it has also a further, a separated point, basically attached to the blade, and with other blades all around. I mean, it's kind of complex, but here I have some pictures of it. And that has basically the same kind of use of the foreshot, aside from the fact that it can be used more like a sort of pike because of the pointy head. Otherwise, the option was knives and other kind of peasant weapons, as it's called in here. Now, the extraordinary thing about this last prescription is that basically, you could be equipped with certain weapons instead than bows. Now, the bow had been usually regarded as something poorer as a weapon than even a pole arm, right? So the question here is, probably the bow was more highly regarded, at least, than other peasant weapons. So this is definitely not enough to say, now everything was about the bow. We remember at the beginning of the video how there is no substantial evidence that archery before the late 13th century was pretty much, a big thing. But still, here it seems that there are tiny hints that it was at least starting to be considered something more than the average peasant weapon, right? This is important. Now, there were naturally other equipment, issued. There are the defensive ones for infantry, accutants or gambesons. So here, these were generally worn at this time, basically by the majority of troops. This kind of, these are textile, they're tissues, they're compact. They have usually they're stuffed with wool or cotton, something like that, and they stop a good amount of blows that do not arrive directly, or maybe they have lost their power. So this was the general. Even horse armor was mostly about this. I mean, every knight would have this kind of defense, at least for his horse, because the rest was incredibly expensive. Now we see that just at the end of the 13th century you have coat of mail, even for the horse, right? So also this is a normal datum. And there is the Statute of Winchester, by the way, doesn't. By the way, I think that this thing that we read about the Forchages Arm, etc., is not from the Assise of Arms, but actually from the Statute of Winchester. So this is still about it. However, the Statute of Winchester, interestingly enough, says that no body armor was issued for men that had less than 100 shillings of land. So this means that most of those kind of troops were not really issued a this kind of defense. It's by the way, these issues are very relative, because, by the way, these guys could have equipped themselves still in some way. I mean, what these recruitment classes tell you is that what you have to mandatorily provide, right? Then, if you want to be equipped with something, even during the campaign, you find a weapon, an armor. You should, most of these troops would still extremely heterogeneously equipped, so it's perfectly normal. However, there is an interim edict of 1230 that specifies, so something more than 50 years before, it is specifying that helmets and gambeson were issued for men with less than 40 shillings of chattel, right? So this is also important because it tells you that, at least back in the day, this was issued, and it could be maybe a proof, but I think it's too scanty. Definitely, these are just mostly hypotheses, that by the beginning of the 13th century, probably this levies were kind of better off. Like it could be kind of wealthier, so that it could afford such a thing. The fact that towards the end of the 13th century you have that, even people were considerably wealthier, they're not issued body armor. Well, here I don't know even about the variation in value, in money value, and all this stuff, monetary value, but it's it could speak for this general impoverishment of the lower classes. At the same time, though, also a kind of progressive specialization of the troops. And actually, I'm not surprised with this, because this happens also elsewhere in Europe. That is, basically the average infantryman, melee infantry. This kind of includes also archers, as we've seen, but for archers it's kind of obvious that they kind of lose. They're increasingly more likely equipped. That they usually are brought maybe in larger masses into the field, at least theoretically, but they kind of do less. And what really is enhanced instead is heavy cavalry, which it turns out in the update with Winchester Statute in 1298, so we are exactly in that time, an increase in missile troops. So it turns out England is doing the same exact thing in here, apparently, right? That the rest of the infantry was kind of falling out of, kind of going down. Actually, this is not what happens in many other places in Europe in terms of, we've seen there, Scotland and Flanders. But for example, this is what is happening in Italy, that before infantry was kind of heavier, then it started progressively lightening down. And the reason is that there is, in that case, not really an impoverishment of the infantry, but really the need to have kind of more specialized troops, even to have more missile offensive power, where you don't really need all these masses to really go into melee, but maybe using pole arms and keeping the enemy an increasing distance, maybe with the lengthening of the pikes and stuff. So here England is fairly similar, and it's kind of makes sense given that the monarchy still has a pretty solid direction in what is going on there, socially speaking, at the middle class, lower class level, right? The barons are really the messy ones, but those are on horseback. Then we have a call to arms of 1264 that provides a list of arms, which includes, in addition, spears, crossbows, and swords. So these are weapons that instead, they're pretty average for the time. Can't really tell here how the whole thing can be really interpreted. Surely the sword here is more, let's say, indicative of here before the helmet and gambesson in 1230 he says, here it's 34 years later. So yeah, it's kind of maybe the last. Here we're exactly before the Civil War of 1264. So this is maybe where things were still kind of nice. Then there is a sort of major collapse, economical one. Could be possible, could be an interpretation, but I don't really know. So heavier troops, even with helmet, swords. So it means that it could even engage in hand-to-hand combat. They weren't kind of a very light militia, right? They could be light infantry, could be used even in this kind of more aggressive roles with swords, helmets, some form, even obviously spears, pretty standard weapon at this time as well. And the interesting part, though, is that the Edict of 1230 gave the same. It gave the arms of poorest category as spear and axe. So this is important. Those freemen with only 20 shillings of chattels were used, were issued to provide spear and axe. This is also interesting because rarely I've heard in say of axes issued for the lowest. I mean, this presence of the axe could be very indicative of a world that was really more rural in many ways, because that's the kind of weapon that excuse me, every kind of peasant has, and it's kind of maybe what that really has. And the spear is also the most basic thing, so it's better than nothing. Still, troops have this offensive, defensive capability, but probably it's not really required much from them. Talking about the aspect of even of these infantry, so you see a relatively homogeneous average range of weapons for 13th century times. Here there is nothing excessively, aside from those things we noticed on the relative importance of the bow, that however is not really mentioned very often before the end of the 13th century. These are pretty standard weapons for 13th century Europe. So talking about so-called uniforms, obviously there was no uniform proper this time, but uniform meant as just a guy that had to be recognized for a certain appearance, right? Excuse me, I drink a little bit before. So we know that a Norfolk contingent recorded in 1295 derived its name from their white tunics, apparently. The term was blanche coats, so it would be white coats, right? And so this is the color that it's kind of normal that there were some units that somehow gave themselves a kind of a similar color for being recognized. And the same unit, by the way, is issued with swords and knives by the local authorities. There are I wouldn't go as far as saying that maybe a sword and a knife, it represents a kind of a more an assault troop. Maybe you have to recognize more clearly, so they had even on the field, because it's tactically very dynamic, so that they have that color, but it's going really too far. However, we have generalized spread of kind of uniforms / recognition devices for certain militia contingents, and for instance, the Red Cross of St. George was issued by Edward I during his Welsh Wars, right? So that was interesting. And other troops, such as spearmen and cavalry, substituted similarly marked lance pennants, right? And this is important. I mean, the rise of this kind of uniform means are particularly they speak for the kind of tactical dynamicization of these times. Like we are extremely far from modern concept of uniform, but it's still the tactical purpose is exactly the same. So at this point, it's important to recognize every contingent, because it obviously has a greater tactical importance, that it is also corresponding to a greater tactical dynamism. So the unit, in other words, kind of moves more around, right? So you need to recognize that. And it also has some psychological value in itself. Gives you a sense of commitment from your side. Also, from the enemy side, it kind of says, oh, look at these guys, they even spend resources for kind of uniforming themselves, so they must be committed and well organized in some measure. But still, the outlook of this armies would be extremely heterogeneous, as you can imagine. But it also speaks for the enlargement of these armies proper, because at this time all the various contingents coming from all the kingdom, in this case, obviously came from different places. They were raised by different noblemen, and they were larger. So at this time, larger armies are to be found on the field. There is a strengthening of the feudal monarchy's ability to levy troops, to at least to pay them for war. So all these factors that intervene. And in fact, given that feudal warfare had been up to this point chiefly, a business of knights, right? You look that in medieval England, baronial contingents already were already marked by sort of uniform. That is, that all maybe the surcoats were same color, or they portrayed similar heraldry. And certainly we know that since the beginning of the 13th century, in 1218, there was a north country robber that bought 100 marks worth of cloth to outfit his following of 18 men, quote, as if he had been a baron or an earl, right? So the idea is that, barons and earls invested into, uniform clothes, let's say, and this is pretty evident because when feudal armies are some of this relatively small contingents, right? What would evolve in the company would be something I don't know, by the beginning of the 13th century, obviously depended on the size of the fief, etc. But these were essentially, some couple of tens, some tens of knights, right? Plus the rest of the retinues that naturally also fought with those colors. So by recognizing an army of, let's say, 1,000 knights, all these units, being colored in a kind of a uniform way was a good way to distinguish yourself. That's what heraldry was in the first place. So never think the uniform. Don't fall into the modernistic trap that wants you to think that uniforms, permanent true units, and other stuff existed only from the modern age because someone snapped and that appeared. There was always this kind of need throughout all military history, properly called. So it's normal, right? So, okay, and more or less this is what I wanted to talk to you about today. And there is much to say. This wanted to be just about English proper infantry, right? So it's obvious that the English employed many other type of troops, including the same Welsh infantries that kind of discussed today, and other troops. So we will have to look at that into detail into another occasion. But this was just to frame a little bit this phase, observing how we know really very few about 13th century English infantry proper, because we know way more about cavalry at this point, because those are preeminent socially and politically, so even we have more evidence from that. But we all framed the development of archery into English armies in this crucial phase of let's say, longbow tactics times. So to observe that probably, even though we don't really know how it was, whether bowmen were kind of more available or had been some changes, I'd say that probably there are some hints that tell you that at least the bow was slightly becoming more important. And from the end of the 13th century, then eventually obviously with the 14th, you have that thing kind of ready, right, to be now framed well and effectively by Edward III and his commanding ability. So yeah, this is more or less what I wanted to tell. And for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.